If you've ever thought about starting a podcast, then you have to keep on watching this video because today I'm going to be breaking down everything you need to know before you start your first podcast. Hey, what's up? My name is Mathilde. Welcome back to the Picsart YouTube channel, and today we're going to be starting the first part of a two-part video series where we're going to be exploring how you can start a podcast and market it. This episode we're going to be focusing on how you can start your podcast and things you need to know before you start. But if you want to stay tuned to know how you can market a podcast, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications because that video is going to be out pretty soon. Without further ado, let's get on with the video. The first step that you need to do when you're starting a podcast is to actually define the niche of your podcast. Is it a true crime podcast? Is it a comedy podcast? Is it an educational podcast? There is some leeway within genre. It's not to say that if you have a true crime podcast, you can't bring some comedic elements into it. Once you have a genre, it's going to be a lot easier to do any of the further steps because you can just rely mostly on genre conventions when you're designing your podcast cover, when you're thinking of a name, when you're thinking of a description. Once you have a genre, you can start thinking of ideas within the genre. And whatever podcast idea that you have, you need to create a niche. There's thousands and thousands of true crime podcasts. What makes yours stand out? So like I said, do you maybe mix it with a little bit of comedy and you have different guests, for example? Or maybe you make it more educational and you interview other people. Just make sure your podcast has a niche so that it can stand out. Getting stuck in this step, then it's time for my most important tip that I pretty much bring up in any video that I post on this channel at this point, which is to research. Do market research, listen to other podcasts that inspire you, or maybe you really like the format of the podcast, which brings me on to step number 2 when you're creating your own podcast, which is establishing the format. Now, podcast in itself is a very standard medium, so it's mostly reliant on audio, but even within that, there's a lot of different ways that you can go. First and foremost, are you going to have one host? Are you going to have 2-3 hosts? Are you going to have a guest? Are you going to alternate between different guests? This is again why I said that researching is super important, because this is when you're going to get all these ideas that are going to make your podcast stand out. Once you have all of this done, it's time to move on to the next step, which is establishing your audience. Do you want it to be men over 30? Do you want it to be young people? Do you want it to be people based in the United States? Do you want it to be a worldwide podcast? Narrowing down your demographic isn't going to mean that other people outside that demographic aren't going to be able to listen to it. It's just going to make it easier for you to choose what type of language and what type of tone you're going to use, not only when you're hosting your podcast, but when you're creating the title, the cover, social media presence, even just choosing what platform it's going to go on. Speaking of platforms, at this point, you should pretty much be ready to start your podcast. So, how are you going to make it? There's a few different options, and I think more and more we're starting to see video podcasts go up on YouTube, and a lot of people even put the videos up on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you get your podcast from. So what type of equipment do you use? I actually really like to pay attention to what my favorite podcasts use. A lot of them actually record on Zoom because the hosts are in different places. Some of them are in studio and some of them are just in their house. So I don't think location is necessarily important when it comes to creating a podcast. However, something that's super important when you're creating a podcast, obviously, is audio quality. Right now, I'm talking to the camera and I would like to, not to toot my own horn, but I think the audio quality is pretty good. And that is because I'm using a microphone. You don't have to buy an expensive microphone. You can just use your headphone mics. The most important thing though is if you're looking for a microphone is to buy a directional microphone. Directional microphones are essentially just going to mean that they're only going to record if you're directly talking into them, which means it's basically not going to record any of the background noise if there is some. So now that you got up to this stage, you're ready to shoot your first episode. Once that's done, it's time to clean it all up, package it nicely, and get ready for upload. All things that you can do on Picsart. If you recorded a video for your podcast, you go ahead and just upload that. And if you recorded the audio separately, you can go ahead and add the audio just by extracting an audio. If you recorded it on like a phone, or if you have an audio file, you can just add this and make sure you sync it up so that obviously your mouth is moving with your sound. And you can go ahead and just edit the podcast however you want. Like I said, there's a few different ways. Some people have like snippets. If you want to do this, just go ahead and scroll to the most interesting part of your podcast and you can just clip that bit and drag it all the way into the beginning. You can even do a little title card after this, which you can do just very easily by going on text and typing up whatever the title of your podcast is. You can add little pictures, little images if you have a logo. And this is just a really quick and simple way to edit it, and you can just go ahead and export it, and now that's ready. To create the art for your podcast, you can go ahead and also go on Picsart. Usually every podcast cover is on a square format, so you can insert whatever picture of yourself or a logo, again, if you have one. If you don't, you can always design it on Picsart. We've done plenty of videos talking about how you can design logos. Just go ahead and import that. Write the title of your podcast. You can mess around with the design. I've tried a few different ones before I landed on this one, which is my favorite. And again, super simple. I'm just going to go ahead and export it, and now it's ready to go on any platform that I want to upload it to. So I hope you guys found this video helpful. It was a quick rundown on how you can start and shoot and edit your first podcast. Like I said, if you want to stay tuned to how to market your own podcast, make sure you subscribe and turn on our notifications, because we will be uploading that pretty soon. Also, if you have any questions, make sure you comment them down below so I can answer them in the next video. Follow us on Instagram, Twitter, and TikTok, and as always, I will see you next week. Bye!